Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm a bilingual cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issues, both court-appointed and private, marriage counseling using the EFT method, dissociative disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, dream analysis, and also provide life, business, and retirement coaching support. I provide individual one-on-one session in English or in French, and also do group settings. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Therapy and Coaching Services at 301-325-1550, and our website can be found at lifecoach.drdanamzallag.com. Today, I'm very excited to have for our 5th episode of Season 9, a very special guest, Dr. Doug Garland, with the tall poppy syndrome concept. And just like every of my past episode, I will leave it up to the guests to properly introduce themselves, as no one can do a better job. Dr. Garland, the floor is yours.
Hi, Dan. So I'm going to talk about the tall poppy syndrome, and I'll give you my history of being tall poppied, and then we can go into the Q&A. So I'm now a retired orthopedic surgeon, but I was in Southern California for 37 years. I was at USC and became a clinical professor of orthopedics there, published over 110 peer-reviewed articles. At one particular time, I was leading the spinal cord injury unit, which is one of the most prominent ones in the country. I was president of the American Spinal Injury Association. I had been at the Rehabilitation Center for 30 years. I was away at a meeting, and I was trying to cement a relationship with Australia to go on a 6-week sabbatical to visit their rehabilitation programs. When I came back from the meeting, there was a note on my door, which was the power door in the hospital corner room with the big window. And it said that I had been moved, my office had been moved from here down to a little cubby hole. I couldn't figure out what happened. I told my wife when I came home from work that day, and she understood. She said, you know, they're after you, your time is up. Somebody's moved your cheese. So the next morning she said, listen, just take Fridays off. I'll take Fridays off and we'll enjoy LA. So I walked up or went in the next day, put my key on the desk, turned around and left. I called the people in Australia, which is the home of the tall poppy syndrome in the English language. And I told them I wasn't coming. And they said, my goodness, you've been tall poppy. So that began my journey in the tall poppy syndrome. I went on to finish my private practice. I retired. I spent the first year doing research, world research on the tall poppy syndrome. And then I spent the next 5 to 10 years writing the book, which was published earlier this year.
Beautiful. So tell us more about what does that mean, the poppy syndrome? What does it entail in terms of like someone's personal behavior and personality?
So the tall poppy syndrome, the metaphor means looking at a top poppy field and seeing one poppy taller than the rest and wanting to cut that poppy down so that everybody's equal. The fascinating thing about the tall poppy syndrome is that it was described in ancient Greece. If you think about it, Socrates was tall poppied, he drank the hemlock. In their description, they used wheat. They lopped off the hips of wheat in the original description.
Okay.
In Rome, Livy described it Rome started 750 BC, and the last king of there's 7 kingdoms. The last one ended at 500 BC. But the story of that king and his son, the relationship and governing people, they also described the tall poppy syndrome, and they actually used the poppy. So that's how far back it goes. The original description, 500 BC, I was able then to trace it through most countries, through various cultures, and they all have different terms and similar metaphors, but it was everywhere but in America. And it's unrecognized here for some reason. And the original premise of the book was we're protected from the tall poppy syndrome because we worship our tall poppies. We have individualism here. We have a meritocracy. Our work is dependent on climbing the ladder of success. And we like to think are the people that are in leadership roles are pretty special people, or tall poppies. So I started the book with that premise. And lo and behold, I found that the tall poppy syndrome was worse in America than in any country. So I determined that it was here. It was just unrecognized. Then I had to figure out that you don't have to be tall to be tall poppy.
Okay.
So I call that peer-to-peer. So that happens in your family. Almost, if you come from a family with a few siblings, your parents try to keep everything equal among the children.
Correct.
So the tall poppy syndrome is happening as you grow up within your own family frequently, certainly in mine with 7 children altogether. Then it happens in your neighborhood. You have neighborhood envy. It happens in the school system, and it happens really at work, especially in anything with a hierarchy. And it's most prominent in the government. One, between politicians, which is very evident every day, is that politicians cut each other down. And the original description in both Greece and in Rome involved politicians. So we don't think about it, but we have the IRS, we have all our various departments, they all have capabilities of cutting the populace down. And trust me, they do it. So I determined the peer-to-peer, which was the individual cutting each other down, which we don't hear about because that doesn't make news. We're not really tall. So then I looked at our tall poppies, and our tall poppies are in media, they're in entertainment, they're in business world, and they're in the government. So that's a separate category, and that's the true metaphor of the tall poppy syndrome. So then I looked at what drives it. So in the peer-to-peer, it's driven mostly by bad envy and anger. Mm-hmm. So envy's divided into 2 components. One is good envy, so that if I look at you and which I did when I checked you out, we checked in this morning, you're a handsome guy, you have a nice goatee, nice hair, and I'm thinking, wow, I wish I could look like that. So the next time we meet, I'm going to have a little goatee too. So that's good envy, and it's flattery, and so I'm imitating you. And bad envy is, I think, man, that guy looks awful in that goatee, and I got a goatee. It's like, wow, I hope I don't look like that. I'm cutting that down. I'm cutting mine off, and I'm telling everybody how awful he looks. So I use the analogy, if your neighbor has a fancy car and you can't get that fancy car, the active bad envy would be to key it or punch a tire out.
Yes.
And the passive bad envy would be to disparage your neighbor to the other neighbors, to make yourself look better and not have him be such a tall poppy. Okay. So that is driven by 2 negative emotions. Well, we use the negative emotions, but as you know, emotions are both positive and negative, but we use the 2 negative aspects of anger and envy. And I mean, the Will Smith episode on the TV with the Oscars, he had anger, which he then took into revenge. And there's a saying, if you take on revenge, dig 2 graves, which means, he was tall popping, but he in the end tall poppied himself, because he's going to pay a much bigger price than the guy he slapped.
Oh, yes.
So then I looked at the behavior of the peer-to-peer, but then I also had to look at the tall poppies themselves. And the strange thing about them, the number 1 leader of why they're tall poppy, they're all tall poppy because of egregious activity. So if we look at Will Smith, for example, we mentioned, if we took somebody like any of our politicians, all the media people that got cut down recently, the governor of New York and the CNN, his brother, that was egregious activity. Pride was behind both of them. Lust was behind certainly the governor, and frequently greed's involved. So I've just named 5 of the 7 deadly sins.
Exactly.
And so if you just think deadly sins, that has kind of a catch term, and then you can start figuring out the emotions that are involved in the tall poppy syndrome. It's a little more complex than the simple metaphor. And what that causes you to do, because you're experiencing the Will Smith episode and you're picking sides. And so you have your own biases come to the top when you do that. And so just understanding their behavior should cause you to self-reflect and understand your behavior as you're part of it. In the public, which that is, you have less influence on that, but certainly in your private aspect, say you got passed over for a job, that frequently causes bad envy and anger. And so you should remember that and then self-reflect and think back, well, maybe that person really does have a qualification that I don't have.
Correct.
So my own being tall poppied was really a fortunate thing for me, even though I'd been there 30 years. I'd put a lot of time and energy in the service. I published a lot from it. But my wife and I, she took Fridays off and we were able to enjoy LA. On Fridays when there was no traffic, I took a position in the private hospital, ran the total joint service and took it to the next level, and just was able to enjoy my practice more because I didn't have another job, and really enjoyed being a doctor, which is very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. So it turned out to be a hugely positive experience. And it was just luck because of my wife. I could have, as I mentioned, become very angry and got into a pissing contest at the hospital and had a power struggle to try and get my office back or something comparable. So just because you get tall poppy doesn't mean it's the end of the world. There should be some self-reflection. And if in fact you are the source of the problem, maybe you can help yourself or seek help.
Do you think that accepting defeat, realizing that you do have limited skills compared to others who may be more qualified than you, then the fact that you accept it will allow you to be able to balance out this tall poppy concept or syndrome, or whatever it is?
Well, I think, yes, that's true. I mean, that's what I learned most, but I actually knew it in medical school. I remember one of the teachers, the professors, are always trying, in those days we called it pimping, to cut us down even in medical school because it's so hard to get into and everybody feels privileged when they get in. And I remember one day one of the professors says, how many of you think you're average? Of course, nobody in there is going to think they're average because they got into medical school. So I sheepishly kind of tried to halfway raise my hand, but the fact is, everybody in there thinks they're better than everybody else. And that carries out in your own life. There are very few people that don't think they're better than somebody else at work and have better skills. And the fact is, that's just not true. Somebody's better qualified or the position's better suited for somebody who may not have similar qualifications. They may not be as smart, but they have a skill you don't have.
That's correct. Exactly. So would you comfortably say, Doug, that those who are dealing with narcissistic disorders are dealing mostly or primarily with this tall poppy syndrome?
Well, that's who's going to be the public tall poppy. So if you look who gets cut down, there's going to be a lot of people with narcissism. And that defines a huge portion of the people in Hollywood. So if you look at the people that do cut down, the Hollywood type, the media type, the political type, narcissism is right up there with the other 3 sins of the 7 deadly sins: pride, lust, and greed. So yes, that's a telltale sign. And I in a similar vein, I use the example that bullying is very similar to the tall poppy syndrome. That people think that, but that's not completely true, because usually there's the person in power is actually bullying the incompetent person, not the low self-esteem, bad envy guy who would be trying to cut down the bully. So it's actually a reversal, but I use the fact that the bully in grade school, because he's been so successful at that, he continues that behavior through high school, through college, through work, moving up, and maybe he becomes a CEO, and all he has is that view of himself being such a great person. And in fact, he's a terrible person and a bully. And then finally, he does something egregious at work and he gets cut down. And then he has to self-reflect, well, why did I get cut down? And somebody tells him, well, you're a bully. Well, he never realized he was a bully until he actually got cut down. So you could look at somebody like Steve Jobs, who had that happen to him. And, you know, he was head of Apple, he was CEO, and the board cut him down. They took it away from him. And what he do? Pardon me?
They brought him back because
yeah, he got cut. That's right, and he did much better. You know, he founded one company, and that led to a lot of different things, and came back to Apple and made it a premier company, which probably would not have happened if he hadn't had a transformation. So that's the good news about being cut down. If you can evaluate the situation and come to the right conclusion, you'll be most likely a better person for having been cut down.
So do you feel that you know, after getting cut down, those who are dealing with the tall puppy syndrome, by becoming humble, this is where they go through this transformation, and then they start realizing that, you know what, I need to not be the person I used to be before, because that was not working. I need to be a new transformed individual. But the thing is that if you look at the example of Steve Jobs, he was a bully before. When he came back to Apple, his personality still didn't really change much. I mean, he was still like a very like dictatorship mentality. So how did he transform himself to becoming a better CEO?
Well, I think even though he still had to be the man, which you weren't going to get rid of, he was able to make a shift and be a little bit more expansive in his thinking, and realizing, like, Ives, the guy that did all the design work on the units, you know, he elevated him not to his level, but he gave him a lot of independence and power. So, you know, he cut down Steve Wozniak, his original partner. He didn't give him any shares. And of course, when Tim Cook and everybody else was coming in the second time around, they had a lot of stock options and stuff. So he was never going to give up control, but he was much more human. He got married, you know, and had an emotionally stable, very wife, I think, who had a big influence on him as well. In the end, he didn't live long enough, but he probably would have had a complete transformation. I mean, Bill Gates did the same thing. You know, he cheated Paul Allen out of his company. And so many of our CEOs just have a sociopathic personality, as you know, that it happens to this group of people, and an aggressive male. And once they get to about 40-ish, most of them have a transformation. And we see that in all of our robber barons in the 1880s. I mean, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, all of them built those empires on the backs of poor, not necessarily poor, but certainly average and below average people. And then they they get into the 40s and start self-reflecting and think, my goodness, what have I done? And then they spend the rest of their life giving the money back away. And you know, Rockefeller, and you can take that group of people and say, my goodness, they were really bad people. But if you take the global view of them, in the end, they really changed not just America, but the entire world with their concepts and what they did.
Mhm.
So we're cutting all of them down now, but I have to say, you know, they're different breeds, and I guess we have to look at them a little bit differently than wanting to cut them down because they were bad people. They did a lot of good things.
So would you say, Doug, that those who actually go into a philanthropy action later on in their life, do you think it's related to them having done a lot of damage and they feel the guilt? So in return, they want to be able to give the money back away so they could balance out this life of guilt?
Well, you can probably get into their heads. I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, they can't just retire and go live on an island in solitude. So they have to do something, and everybody likes to say give back. So to a certain extent, they give back kind of what they took to equal the ledger out.
So basically, they act like the IRS. They basically take the money away from your paycheck, and at the end of the year, they give it back with no interest.
Right, right.
So
well
that's
said.
an interesting strategy.
Well said.
I read about what Bill Gates was doing when he was starting with being the CEO of Microsoft. He said that he learned by heart all the license plate of all the staff, and he was knowing who was at the office and who wasn't, and how come people were not coming and staying long enough, as long as him. And what he failed to realize is that that was his company. People, they didn't own that company, so they would not put as much energy, love, effort as he did. But he didn't get that. He didn't really understand the human dynamic when it comes to, if you don't own something, you're not going to kill yourself to be able to make it grow, because it's not a part of you. It was a part of Bill Gates. But that was interesting to see how much of a control he had over the company.
Yeah, I mean, even my little peer-to-peer office, I had the corner office, I could see everybody come in. I knew who came in, you know, at 8:15 instead of 8 o'clock. So, well, I mean, if you're running any organization, you know, if you get to the top frequently, if you've worked your way up and you do own it, that is a feeling that most of them have. And I had it to a little bit, and I'm sure some of my staff felt, man, I'm glad I don't have to walk by that guy every morning. You know, it's 8:20, they're tiptoeing by and hoping I have my head buried in a book, not looking up to see who just walked by. So that's part of the deal, that's for sure.
But how long did it take you to be able to write that book, Doug, about the tall poppy syndrome? I mean, when you decide to really like put it into a manual, you know, how did you start with it? How did you create those different components of the book before it got published?
Well, first it was very difficult for me because I came from a scientific background. And so the first year I spent the year in the library. Well, the library now is not what it used to be, because you sit at your home. If you have kind of the old library card, which in medicine, the medical library, the problem with the virtual library is if I want a journal and I don't subscribe to it, I'm not going to get the journal. So you have to, even though if you go in a medical library, there's no books in there, they subscribe to all these journals, so you have access to them. So I used our medical library, and I still went in just because I do better in a library research than I do at home, because that's what I did. So I spent a year just doing search of the world literature for the tall poppy syndrome. And then I got a good feel, and in using the term the tall poppy field of the English speaking language, it's a cultural phenomenon in Australia, and it's fun to understand why, because Australia was founded as a penal colony.
Okay.
And in the penal system, everybody's equal.
Okay.
So if you're in the penal system and somebody has a toothbrush and you don't, that's really bad. You know, they have something you don't, which is what envy is. Envy is coveting something that somebody else has. And so the penal system, the envy runs rapid in that. And so that became the culture, the egalitarian culture of everybody being equal in Australia. So that country is rich in the tall poppy syndrome and in their literature, in their psychosocial literature of understanding it. So I learned the most from that country, but I didn't learn anything about the tall poppies. And because it was all cutting people down and they don't have very many tall poppies. So I actually had about a third of their first draft was how to become a tall poppy.
Okay.
Because I couldn't get that from Australia. But as I researched that, there are 10,000 books a year published on how to be a tall poppy. It might be on cooking, it might be on exercise, it might be on finances, but what the world doesn't need is another self-help book.
Yes.
Because every year there's 10,000 new ones.
Yes, correct.
And I thought, well, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of inspiration, but there's not a lot of transformation and action.
Correct.
So I deleted all that and still not trying to do a self-help book, began to dissect the behavior of the tall poppies and the cutters, what I call the cutter, which is the bad envy person and low self-esteem, and the cuttee, which is the true tall poppy. And then I figured out, I grew up Catholic, and the 7 deadly sins are a huge part of Catholicism. And so then I started looking, and the only thing that wasn't involved was really laziness and gluttony. And I needed a catch term to help people understand, because when I tell you, oh, you got tall poppy, or it's the tall poppy syndrome, don't worry about it. Everybody has this blank look. Mm-hmm. But when I describe it, then everybody gets the concept. So then I wanted to look at the behaviors between the two groups. So it was quite extensive. That wasn't until the 4th draft that I had a workable book that I thought was good enough for the public, but it took me 5 to 10 years to get to that level.
Wow.
And the book is the other problem is the problem with the internet. There's a lot of information on the internet, but the information is not all completely true, and most of it's partly true. So coming from a scientific background, I didn't want a partly true book. It has over 600 citations. So I wanted kind of the definitive guy on the tall poppy syndrome. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit of a hard read for some people, but if you read the book and have the time, it's not going to be a page turner. You'll understand a lot about the world. You'll understand about America. You'll understand American politics. You'll understand your neighborhood. And mostly you'll understand a lot about yourself.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, Doug, that is unfortunately all the time that we have for today's podcast. I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us. And thank you again for participating and inspiring the many listeners with your incredible story and the concept of the tall poppy syndrome. Now, we hope that you've all enjoyed today's episode. I'm very excited about the many upcoming guests that we have scheduled for season 9 of the Happiness Journey podcast, filled with inspirational stories just like the one that you listened to today. Now, here are some concluding words of wisdom. People say, I'll sleep when I'm dead, as they hasten that very death, both literally and figuratively. They trade their health for a few more working hours. They trade the long-term viability of their business or their career before the urgency of some temporal crisis. If we treat sleep as a luxury, it is the first to go when we get busy. If sleep is what happens only when everything is done, work and others will constantly be impinging on your personal space. You will be frazzled and put upon, like a machine that people don't care of and assume it will always function. Staying delusional in life is a choice, and thinking that your body will be able to endure constant torture by failing to eat healthy, exercise enough, and get quality and quantity amount of sleep is failing in the delusional aspect of a healthy lifestyle. In some cases, your body can tolerate some beating. It is made for that, some kind of resilience to your neglectful behavior. But the question remains, can you handle being a time bomb or waiting to explode at any minute? If you like playing Russian roulette, this is certainly not a great life to live by. But if you want to live proactively and feed your body with proper nutrients, exercise, and sleep, then you're on your way to living a long and healthy life. My name is Dr. Dan Amzallag, and you may all keep pursuing your amazing journey in life.